Josh, it's great to have you on the show.
I'm glad to be here. I've been a long time listener, so this is a little bit intimidating, but fun to do it with you.
I want to start by taking a look at your website because I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about how you're building your business, Josh, is how you've combined your personal passion for the outdoors and for adventure, and you've really carried that through to the business side in terms of your branding and your presentation. You've also got a podcast, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. So I'm just going to flip over to the website and share that. And I'd love to get some of your comments on this. So here's your homepage and your tagline here: financial life planning for the explorer living out their bucket list. And then the subline there is planning your wealth on purpose so that you can pursue your great adventure now. Meet with your guide. So some very clear branding there. So I'd love for you to walk through sort of the thinking behind that, the history behind that, when you did a rebrand to make this more of the adventure side.
Yeah, there was a lot of work and effort that went into redoing the website a couple years ago, and I hired a group out of San Diego. Aaron Haggard, I believe is how you say her last name, but I can't speak highly enough about them. They not only did a great product, but the process of everything that you see on my website, they drew out of me, right? This was not something that I just threw on a piece of paper one day. And it took months, and they were really good about that. But it started with renaming the company from a name that was more tied with a CPA firm that I'd worked with for many years. And in the process, once I committed to renaming it, I had to go through, what do I want to name it? Do I name it after me? Do I name it after, make up some word? And through conversation with you a lot, it really came down to making it something that is meaningful and aspirational. And that's where I came up with Ridgeline. And part of that comes from anytime I've stood on a ridge line, it's never been a bad day. It's never been a bad view. And so it has this aspirational tone to it, which is where, when I got to the website, I wanted the website to continue with that, from the pictures to the phrasing, and ultimately trying to speak to a certain group of people that I come across or spend time in the outdoors, because I find that those are my kind of people. And if somebody finds me through the website and this resonates with them, then they're probably my kind of people. And so that's the process that I went to get to it. And I'm very proud of where the website ended up, because I think it really, Karin did a great job of hitting the nail on the head with this.
Yeah, and you've really carried it through the whole website here. So for example, continuing to scroll down on the homepage, your personal money trail guide, you've got the person there backpacking. You use the word guide a lot, which is
That person is actually my son.
that's your
So
son. Okay.
yeah, there are many pictures throughout this website that are pictures that I took on different trips. And this was one on the Appalachian Trail where we had hit, it's called a bald. It's a point of the trail where there's no vegetation and you can see 360 degrees. And I took that picture from behind him, and that's one of my favorite ones for sure.
And that looks like a pretty heavy backpack there.
Yeah, the thing about being a section hiker is I always overpack, and the pack ends up being probably twice as heavy as it should be. And then compared to some of the thru hikers that are ultra lightweight, we look like amateurs.
Yeah, and then just continuing here, technology to guide performance and perspective. So again, we got the word guide in there, and then the About Us page. And up at the top here, where it says Base Camp. So instead of the home page, we've got Base Camp, which of course is an outdoor term. And then if we go under Insights, we've got the podcast. And I do want to spend some time on this. So you have a podcast. It's called the On Adventure Podcast with Josh Self. So tell me a little bit about the genesis of the podcast. What made you want to do a podcast? How did you come up with the topic for the podcast? What was the objective with the podcast when you launched it?
So the first episode I recorded, I believe, was in the fall of 2022, and I didn't release it until, I think the first episode came out the January of 2023. And it really came down to, I wanted to do something different. I've been in this business for over 20 years. And as anybody that has been doing this for that amount of time. There's parts of this that become routine and a little bit monotonous. And so I was looking for kind of a creative outlet, a way to do something a little bit different. And it started as really a passion project that had no real intention of weaving it back into the business. And that has certainly changed in the last year in how I view it. And the reason I picked adventure is because it's something that I like talking to people about this. I always have. And whether it's your trips or other friends that I have, having that conversation about what they do, how they do it, how they plan it, how did it go, all of those kind of things. They were just conversations I enjoyed having. So as I thought through what kind of podcasts I wanted to have, number one, I knew I did not want to have a money podcast. There's way too many of those already. And I didn't want to just keep digging in that same hole that I've been digging in for 20 years. And so it was a way to be creative and try different things and talk to some very interesting people. And at this point, I think I've recorded maybe 35 episodes. And most of the people that I've interviewed, I never would have come across them in life. And they've been super interesting, super compelling conversations and challenging to me as well. But I've loved it. I took way too long to get started with it and came up with all kinds of reasons why I couldn't do this or that. But once I've gotten into it and found a rhythm with it, I love the podcast days is what I've tried to have once a month where I'm recording conversations and all in on that. And when I have a podcast day, it's a pretty good day because I enjoy the conversation.
And do you see any similarities here between the topics that you're talking about here in terms of adventure? And you've had some really interesting guests here. Like one of your guests is a guy that has summited Mount Everest. What is it? 17
18.
times, I think. 18 times.
Now.
Yep.
Yeah.
18 now. Kenton Cool. And that's his real name.
Yes.
So have you seen any similarities between how your guests are approaching risk? Has it changed how you think about risk, whether it's risk when you're out doing your own adventures or whether it's how you think about risk in the financial markets and with your clients?
I've certainly learned preparation skills from talking to these different folks. But what I've also seen is an overlap with how they approach adventure and how we approach planning. It's planning around finances instead of planning around a trip or an expedition. But you always have to prepare. You always have to. Now, I've read stories. I haven't talked to anybody like this, but I've read stories of people that go right off the couch into a through hike or straight off the couch into some extreme thing and live to tell about it. I would not recommend that. I would not want to do that either. That seems like unnecessary suffering. But most of these folks are great planners and are tremendously prepared. And part of that is understanding the landscape that they're going into. What are the risks and what are the challenges? When are they going to hit those challenges? And what are going to be the pivot points? What's the optionality that they have at different points? And all of that overlays really tightly to financial planning and preparing for the future, preparing and understanding the landscape of what we're looking at and making sure we have optionality in the plan so that when we get to different pivot points in the future that we have the ability to do that. But I've seen a lot of overlap in that. And I don't know that one has informed or made me better in either category. I just think that they're both pushing in the same direction. And that's been a welcome surprise. I didn't expect that overlap going into it.
Speaking of surprises, what might be an example of an interesting story from one of your guests? Because I've looked through your list, I've listened to some of your episodes, and there's some wild characters that you've got there, and they're doing some really fascinating things. And I'm curious, as you think about that response there, are most of these people just incorporating these adventures into like their normal life? Like they're just, quote, normal people with normal jobs and they just happen to do these adventure things on the side? Or have some of these people just like their whole life is adventure and that sort of is their career, or maybe some combinations? What are your thoughts there?
I think maybe Hinton is possibly the only professional explorer that I've interviewed. Everyone else is what I call the everyday explorer. They're like me and you, they got real jobs, they've got real families. But what they've done is they've been intentional to make this adventure pursuit a priority in their life. And they've pulled it off because of that. I was what about a month ago, I was talking to our friend Skip Schweiss, and he said exactly that. If it's important to you, you make it a priority. And his outdoor adventures have always been important to him. And so he went through a great detail of all the different things that he's done, and it's turned into his excellent adventures, which were fun to talk about. I think another interesting one, guy's a crazy dude. His name is Pete Ripmaster, and that is actually his last name, Ripmaster. I questioned him on that, and he said he gets that all the time, but he's no, it's really it. But he did this race called the Iditarod. I think it's the Iditarod 350, and you had to finish the Iditarod 350 to be able to qualify for the Iditarod 1000. And those are self-supported, pull your own sled on the Iditarod Trail on foot in February. And so he went through several details of how the first time he did the shorter race, he completely bonked and didn't finish. The second time he did it, he actually finished and qualified to do the 1,000-mile race, and then won that race. Only 9 people were in the race, but he finished first. And I forget how many, it took him more than a month. I forget the exact length of time, but imagine pulling probably a couple 100-pound sled across the frozen snow in Alaska with no civilization around you for days on end in sub-zero temperatures. And he did that over and over again. And it's a fascinating story that, as I kept talking to him, I was like, this guy's just a normal dude. He's got a wife and kids, but he did this extraordinary thing, and he's still doing these extraordinary things. He's now raising money for a charity, but his project is a 100-mile race in each state of the United States. No one's ever done it before. And I think he's over 30 states now, but he's done a 100-mile run in over 30 states, and he's trying to get to all 50 of them. And I think he's trying to raise $50,000 or $60,000 for his charity to do it. But most people if they ever run a 100-mile race, you put that award on the wall and talk about it. He's trying to do 50 of them, and he's actually done more than that. So just an extraordinary outcome, but of just a normal guy that has made this a priority in his life. And so that's an interesting one. The Galapagos Postman is another one that's a very different kind of adventure. A guy that has found an ancient post box in a bourbon barrel on a remote island in the Galapagos Islands that people drop anonymous letters in. And it goes back to the 1700s, I believe, but he's actually picked up 50 of these anonymous letters and is spending a year traveling around the world hand delivering them. And the stories that he's getting out of, in his words, reconnecting the world one letter at a time is fascinating and really fun to talk about the kind of the stories of humanity that he's come across. But he's based in England. Kenton Coole's based in England. Pete Ripmaster's in Asheville, North Carolina. And I've interviewed people in California and Washington. And so just people that I never, ever would have come across in my normal day job as a financial planner.
Obviously, in your day job as a financial planner, you have to communicate, you have to be articulate. In many cases, you're a storyteller. So as you're doing these podcasts, you're hearing all of these other great stories. So has there been any connection between hearing these really fascinating stories, and has it helped you become a better storyteller in your work as a financial advisor? Do you sometimes share some of the stories of the people that are guests on your podcast with your clients to try and make a point? Have you found some way to translate these adventure stories into communication points with your clients?
Absolutely. And it hasn't happened on purpose. It's more organic. but and were my clients. I sent out an email and announced it early on. And then I sent out a monthly newsletter and would post in there. And I've since tried to expand the audience a little bit outside of just our firm, but I've got several clients that are dedicated listeners to every episode and will email me. I can't believe you talked to this guy, and that was such a great story. And I've had several that were like super inspiring and just overcoming challenges and suffering and the things that they learned through it and on the other side. And so I do use that in client meetings. Some of it's specific, but more broadly, just talking about what does it mean to live your great life right now. I'm not really interested in helping people build bigger and bigger buckets of money just for the sake of having a bigger bucket. And I think these are great stories of how people are doing that in the real world. I don't know that I'm not sure if it's made me a better storyteller or not. I think what it has done is made me a better story capturer. That may not even be a word, but what I'm finding in these podcast interviews is that my 20 plus years of running client meetings and asking questions and having an overarching goal for the conversation, but still trying to ask questions and listen, it's exactly what I do in the podcast. It's the exact same format, but the more I've done it in the podcast and had active listening skills through that, I don't go in with a whole list of questions. I go in with some thoughts and then just try to carry the arc of the conversation through that. And that I think has made me better as a financial planner. I'm fairly certain of that. In the last 2 years, I've been more intentional with the way that I think and approach client meetings and what is the arc of the conversation that I'm wanting us to get to, and then having a few points to cover on the agenda, but then listening to the responses and adjusting questions to those responses.
And I think you've done a great job at that, because oftentimes when I'm listening to a podcast, obviously I have a few podcasts, I've done a few episodes over the years. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll be listening to the episode and the guest gives a response. And then I'm asking myself, okay, based on what that guest just said, if I was the host of this episode, what would I be asking next? And sometimes I'm like, I'm at a loss. I'm not quite sure what I would say based on what the guest just said. And so I'm always like, okay, I wonder what this host is going to say. And I'm listening to you and I'm like, you're so natural when you're having these conversations, and nothing's rehearsed in it. Like you say, you may have a few points that you want to talk about, but nothing is really scripted out. And it's very much in the moment. It's very clear that you're really paying close attention to the guest. You're hearing what they're saying, you're listening to it, and you're genuinely interested in what they're saying, and you're curious. And I think that certainly makes a great podcast host, is when you have that genuineness and that curiosity in the guest. And you can always tell a great host when you ask the question that I'm thinking, and that happens often. So I think you're doing a great job there with that.
I appreciate that. That does mean a lot coming from you, and you've certainly helped push me along through this and honing it. But it's also fairly easy to do that because it's topics that are super interesting to me. I think if I was talking about Roth IRAs, I don't know that I'd be that engaged. I do that in my day job. And so I find the stuff that these folks are talking about really compelling. And I talk to my wife about them all the time. You wouldn't believe what this guy does. And I'm trying to figure out what that means for me, just as a person that loves adventure, that loves getting outdoors and trying hard things. And I'm not going to go climb Mount Everest 18 times. That's really just not something I'm all that interested in. But does Pete Ripmaster's ultra marathon record, does that challenge me to maybe go do an ultra marathon sometime? Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely things that are, I think, within my potential that talking to these folks has definitely been an encouragement in that direction.
Where do you think your desire for adventure and your motivation to go out and get off the couch and do some of these things, like through hike the Appalachian Trail or segments of the Appalachian Trail and some of the other things, adventures that you've done, where did that come from?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I remember as a kid being outside, and I did at a young age, did Boy Scouts and different trips with that. I remember in high school going camping with some buddies, and that was pretty fun and limited. And I think part of the pursuit of trying hard things started for me probably after our last child was born, and I was really out of shape and probably more overweight than I wanted to be. And went to the YMCA one day, and they had a sign for an interest meeting for the triathlon club. And I can ride a bike, and I used to swim, and I know how to run. I'll go give it a shot. And my wife was supportive of it. And I got into doing that and did the first race and absolutely sucked wind the entire time. And it was a short race. And as soon as I finished, I couldn't wait to do the next one. And so that got me into doing stuff that was fairly hard. And along that time, I had a buddy that was really into backpacking, and we started hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail, and I took my son with me. And so it's been more of an arc or a curve than it is deeply rooted in my childhood. But I do remember times through my childhood of being outside or being in the mountains somewhere with a vista or a view, and that sense of awe and smallness that I can think of specific times way back into my childhood. And that's a lot of what I pursue in getting outside. I don't do triathlons, or haven't done a triathlon in a long time. And I really don't know that I don't have much of an interest to run on pavement anymore, but I run trails. And so that's overlapping exercise with this love of being outside and nature therapy, and really taking in what I can get from the woods, and I can't get enough of that. And so it has definitely changed over the years for me, but that's part of why I do it now, is the challenge that goes into it, but also the overlap with being outside and somewhere where I love to be.
I also find it interesting when I talk to people like you and I talk to other adventure people, and I think about some of the outdoor stuff that I do as well. In that you talked about your first triathlon, and you said I was sucking gas the whole way, but when I finished, I couldn't wait to do another one. And so it seems like oftentimes during these activities, it's hard work, it's difficult, it's uncomfortable, I'm freezing, it's raining, I'm wet. It's to an outside observer, you'd think, wow, that just must be miserable. Yet when we're done, we're like, oh, that was great. And so I'm curious how you define fun, in the sense that you look at a hard adventure and it's physically exhausting. Yet when we finish, we're like, it was great. Let's do that again. So do you have like different definitions of fun, meaning there's a hard kind of fun, and then there's a fun, I'm at the beach with my friends and we're throwing a Frisbee around kind of thing? How do you think about fun when it relates to a really physical activity like the outdoor stuff you're doing?
I've never parsed it like that, but I think that's a fair way to split it up, that there's non-suffering fun and then suffering fun. And
Yeah.
that's part of there's an underlying theme, and sometimes I'll tell my guests this in advance and sometimes I won't, but there's an underlying theme that I'm trying to drive at with the questions of, why do human beings do hard things? Because you think that if it was really hard and you suffered a lot, you would avoid doing that. And yet we do it over and over again. And I really believe that, as I've learned more about how the brain actually works, that we don't do anything really without it being a reward on the other side. And so if the suffering thing has a reward on the other side, what is that reward? And that's why I ask the questions in the podcast, to try to figure out what that is for each person. And sometimes they're able to articulate it, and sometimes they're like, I don't know. I just get done. And really, it's like this neurochemical mixture in the brain is the reward itself that keeps them coming back to doing it over and over again. But as I think about what the suffering fun, as I was just saying a second ago, there's a guy I interviewed named Matt Walker that's a mountain guide out in the state of Washington, but he's also has a master's in psychology and a trained psychologist. And he's got he calls it the 5 elements of adventure that include high endeavor, uncertain outcomes, total commitment, tolerance for adversity, and then great companionship. And that, I can't do a better job of describing what suffering fun looks like. Like, it does have those 5 elements of, I'm not sure how this is going to end. I've taken a calculated risk here. It's going to be a challenge and I might fail. But I've had many guests tell me failure isn't not getting to the top of the mountain, whatever that proverbial goal is. That's not the goal. The goal is in the journey itself. And when people have been able to make that shift, the outcome really is much less important than the journey itself. And I've been told that over and over again. But this idea of tolerance for adversity too, I've really enjoyed that as I've done these different things. And I have not done near some of the extreme things that other people have, but I see that expansion of the comfort zone that turns into growth. And whether that's within my profession of trying to learn more and stretch myself, that having that turn into growth, or being outside and trying to get in better and better shape and doing harder and harder things, stretching through the discomfort into growth is a big part of it. And the last piece of that is one of the more fascinating to me, is the great companionship. And one of the things that Matt said is, anytime he's done anything solo, and granted, even that term solo may be a misnomer, where you might go do something by yourself, but it takes the support of other people in your life, whether it be a partner or family member or friends that help you be able to go do that. So you're not really doing anything solo. But anytime he's done something like that versus gone with a group of friends or people that he enjoyed being around, he remembers the latter. He remembers the specifics of the ones with the group and the people that he cared about in much greater detail than the ones that he went and climbed a big mountain on his own. And I would say that's absolutely been the case for me as a committed introvert, which I am. There's still no question that doing things with other people, especially people that I really like and care about and are really important to me, it's like throwing gas on the adventure fire. And so I like those elements of adventure, and I give all the credit to Matt Walker there.
Yeah, I think those 5 are great. And the camaraderie piece certainly puts an exclamation point on it. You had mentioned Skip Schweiss earlier in his excellent adventures that he and Chip Rome have organized for many years now. I've been on a handful of those trips, and I'm probably going to get this slightly wrong, but they always say we have 3 objectives with these excellent adventures. One is that everyone comes back safe and sound. And second is that there's a possibility of death along the way. And then the third is that we all have a great fun time and can celebrate afterwards. And so far, no one has died. We've had a broken bone, namely my ankle on one of the trips a few years ago. I'm not sure if there's been other broken bones besides mine, but certainly at least one. But yeah, it is that camaraderie of being out there. It's the shared hardship, but when you're sharing it with other people, it makes it much more enjoyable. And then the stories that you tell afterwards when you've completed it, to me, that's just such a great feeling as well. So
that's part of the other, I said a minute ago that I want to get at why people do hard things and choose to suffer. But the other part B of that is, I want to know what they learned when they push past that limit. And the illustration I give is, you're at the top of a double black diamond with the tips of the skis hanging over the edge of the slope. And at some point you have to decide to either back up and take the walk of shame back to the ski lift, or you're going to drop in and feel that split second of weightlessness and dropping into the bowl and doing this really hard thing, and then getting to the other side of that and discovering that, man, I can do it. I didn't think I could do that and survive, but I actually just did. And I think maybe that's why people keep coming back, is it's that stretching through the comfort zone. And that's what I want to learn is, how did you push yourself? In what ways did you really stretch beyond your preconceived limits, but what did you learn on the other side of that? And those have been really fascinating parts of the conversations.
And I'd love to hear what some of the guests have said about that. And while you're thinking about that, what I've also found along those lines is that there are some people that are just thrill seekers in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that they just do like really crazy stuff. And I'm not so sure it's because they want to find something on the other side that there's what can I discover? It's just more like it's an adrenaline junkie
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. And maybe they're running away from something or what have you. There may be some other deeper psychological things going on there. And as I think about when I do adventure stuff, it's definitely not because I'm a thrill seeker per se, because I'm not going to do anything where I don't have a plan B and I don't have some plan that like if I fall on the mountain, I don't think I'm going to die because I'm going to be roped up and I'm going to have a professional with me. I take those kinds of precautions. But what I'm also interested in, and someone pointed this out to me, and I thought it was insightful in the sense that when I do these adventure things, I'm so focused, I'm so present, I'm so in the moment because I have to be, because it's a
Mm-hmm.
situation where I can't let anything else distract me. And this person was saying to me that when you can have that same level of presence, that same level of awareness, that same level of not having the distractions while you're just sitting at home on the floor or not in a situation where it really requires that level of focus and intensity. That's when you're sort of evolving.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yep.
I've always thought about that. And so I think about these bookends in my life where on the one end, I might be out on some adventure trip where I have to be focused. On the other end, I'm just walking through a forest. And it's like, how can I have the same level of presence and lack of distractions when I'm in the intense situation as when I'm just walking on a trail in a forest? And so that to me is a practice. And so when I think about one of my learning on the other side of the danger, it's like, how can I take this same level and apply it just back in my normal day-to-day life? And to me, that's a challenge. It's like peeling the layers of the onion. There's
Yeah.
always more to that. There's never a stop. There's never an end. There's never you reach the point where there's no
Mm-hmm.
more. There's always more. And so that's what sort of gets me excited about these things too. It's just this idea that there's always another level. There's
Mm-hmm.
always another depth to it. There's always another nuance to it. And that's how I think of mastery as well. I don't think anybody is a master of anything. Even the very best in the world at something is not, in my definition, a master because there's always another level that you can go. And I personally, knowing that I can always get better at something or learn something or go deeper, that's very motivating to me.
Yeah, I love that. And it brings a couple things to my mind. So the idea, and I'll reference one of my podcast guests because I took this from him, but that we have this comfort zone, and then outside of the comfort zone is our growth zone. But if we expand too far past the growth zone, you enter the death zone, right? So there is an element where, as we've talked before, if you take just stupid risk without the ability to support yourself or option into something else, then you can die doing a lot of these things. But the thing with the comfort zone is if it's not expanded, if it's not pressured, that it will atrophy. And so not doing anything, you are actually actively shrinking your comfort zone. And the more that you do actively do nothing, the smaller your comfort zone gets down to a point where you can't do anything without it being so scary and full of fear and difficult because you haven't continually pursued growth. And this is coming from a guy, his name is Robbie Linfesti. And I don't have time to go into all aspects of his story, but one of the most interesting things was when he was in college, he went to Argentina for what he thought was a summer internship on a big ranch in Patagonia. Turns out he was working for a guy that used to be a billionaire and had squandered the billions into a few million left. And ended up, this guy was, I think, trafficking wine or something else across the Patagonian backcountry. And Robbie got caught in the middle of it. And they were literally in the middle of nowhere when he realized what was going on and was essentially held captive by one of the guys with running this mule train through the Patagonia to where he had to after a couple of days, he and two other people stole some horses in the middle of the night, rode the horses. It took him 2 to 3 days before they found any civilization. They weren't even sure they were going in the right direction. And they eventually got back to safety, thankfully. And then he proceeds to tell me that within a month, he became the youngest person to solo climb Aconcagua, which is a fairly high, I don't know the exact height
It's
of
one
the
of the
peak.
seven summits. Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
highest peak
And
in South America.
he did this within weeks of being kidnapped and almost dying. He was held at gunpoint, told that they were going to shoot him many times. And so this is a guy that has continued to not let fear stop him, when for most people it would have stopped us in our tracks in order to find safety. And he's found safety by continuing to stretch that comfort zone and growing through that. So I think that's the best illustration I can think of, that growth is the opportunity with these adventures. And I'm not interested in just interviewing somebody for the adrenaline story. There are certainly adventure addicts out there, and I say that it's not really tongue in cheek. I think it can be an addiction in a lot of the same ways that other either substance or process addictions occur within the brain. That's not what I'm driving at with these conversations. It's not just the cool story and man, that was awesome. It's more of where is the growth and how did you get to the growth and how are you continuing to come back to it? So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I think the comfort zone piece of that is so critical. And I think, and I'm going to generalize here, but I think generally as we get older, we tend to take fewer risks. And I find I'm the opposite of that.
Mhm.
And I find as I get older, I just want to continue to expand things. And again, this is not the adrenaline junkie kind of risk, but just trying new things. Sailing is my new thing here in the past year and a half or so. So really enjoying doing some new things in that area that's totally stretching me out of my comfort zone. But again, I'm with, in most cases, if it's an ocean kind of thing, I'm with professionals who know what they're doing. So I'm not envisioning I'm going to do a
Yeah.
solo sail across the Atlantic or something. Who knows, maybe, but
Not
not
yet,
on the
maybe,
bucket list at the
right? I
moment.
mean,
Maybe not yet.
there's progression to any of these adventures that
That's right.
you do have to prepare yourself through more and more challenges, and then maybe you do get there.
Yeah. And I'm curious. So again, I was stereotyping like, hey, as we get older, we tend to not do more of these adventures. Yet very clearly, as a financial advisor working with clients that are in or near retirement, they want that part of their life to be a happy time and not necessarily a sedentary time. So do you find that some of your conversations that you're having with your podcast guests then are, yeah, you maybe touched on this a little bit earlier about it, but inspiring to your clients, like getting them to get off of the couch
Yeah.
and realize that, hey, just because I turned 60 or I turned 65 doesn't mean that I can't go and do fun stuff anymore, or I can't turn my life around if I'm, not in good health, and there's still opportunity here. So is that part of the magic in the podcast as well, to some extent?
I think so. And that was not, again, as I said earlier, not intentional. It's been a very nice surprise to see where that can overlap back into the conversations I'm having with clients in building plans that allow them to live their great life right now. A couple of my interviews were actually with clients. One client I think she was 81 or 82 when I interviewed her. Another one was 76 or 8 at the time. And it was a lot about, what are you doing right now to still try to pursue adventure in an appropriate way for someone that's your age. And they had great stories. In both cases, it was, I can't do what I did in my 40s, but I'm going to do what I can do right now to keep trying to challenge myself and grow. And it just looks different. And that's another thing that I've started asking questions, especially to some guests that are maybe in their 70s and still doing mountain climbing and still doing long distance hiking. I know at some point their body's not going to allow them to do that. And so I've had to come up with a delicate way to ask the question, but I want to know, what are you prepared for? What is this shift to when you can't climb a 14,000 foot peak, but how do you still find the challenge and find the adventure into doing something that your body will allow you to do? And those have been fun conversations. But I think, to your point a second ago, the healthy people are the ones that there is no end to this. The end will come when the last breath is taken. And until then, they still try to find ways to push and grow and stretch themselves.
Yeah. And I love what you just said there about I can't do today what I could do back in my 40s when I was, say, 20 years younger. And that's exactly true for me. And because I think about if I go way back to my teenage years and early 20s, I was a fairly competitive distance runner. I can't run anywhere close to what I did back in the day, nor am I trying. So to me, what I find fascinating is I had about 20 years worth of climbing mountains, and I may still do a few more, but at some point it's not going to be good for me to be doing that. So I look for what's the next thing that I can
Yeah.
start really getting excited about. And I mentioned sailing. I'm really enjoying that because it's a whole new thing. It's something I can continue to do as I get older. And I'm just learning so much, like little things. And this is going to sound probably fairly mundane, but it's like I get a kick out of learning how to tie different knots. And in mountain climbing, there's a handful of knots I had to know. In sailing, there's a handful of knots. And so I drive my wife crazy at night. I've got my little piece of rope and I'm sitting here tying bowlines along the handle on the oven and round turns with 2 half hitches and all these. I'm just like practicing all these different knots. I get a kick out of that.
Yeah.
And it's dumb, but it keeps me engaged and keeps me thinking about things. And every so often there'll be something around the house. Oh, let's tie these 2 pieces of rope together. We just did this the other day. We had to lower a big plant container from our upper level deck to our lower level deck. And I said, oh, I'll just tie a bowline. It's got a hook on it. I'll tie these 2 ropes together and then I'll just lower it down to you. And it's okay. Again, dumb, but it
You're
was,
making up ways to do it. Yeah.
I'm making up things to do with my
Yeah.
ability to tie knots. Again, it just keeps you engaged, and it's just something that I find I'm learning new stuff. And so it's as you age, as you're saying, you got to figure out what can I do at this age to
Yeah.
stay engaged. And I think that's one of the great things that advisors do when you're working with retired people is like just helping them think about those things so
Yeah.
that again, we're not just sedentary and there's just so much to life. And people like you do such a great job working with your clients, and you've got this great podcast out there that's inspiring people. So I think it's just another example of the great work that you do.
No, I appreciate
So
that. I think we've all heard the stories of the people that retire and within 3 months they're dead. It was
right.
they retired to the rocking chair and spent their whole life getting to a point of when they don't have to do anything. And I think my example of clients that are still doing this in their 80s and early 90s, they're defying that. And I think that's interesting that the body does that, that when it's not challenged, it just goes, okay, I think we're done here. And I think I love being in those conversations and hearing, whether it's hearing the stories of the way folks that are older are still finding ways to appropriately challenge themselves, or being the one to bring up the conversation in a client meeting to say, what else are you going to do with this money that you spent your whole life saving, right? I mean, the only value of money is in its use, really. So how are you going to use this to be in line with the things that are most important to you? And so it's a permission slip sometimes to go, okay, yeah, I can go do this thing. And sometimes it's a cruise for somebody that has stayed their whole life in this tiny little radius around the city that they raised their family in and worked in. Taking a cruise may feel like a huge adventure. Or the person that is going to go find a mountain to climb or trail to hike, or one of my guests rode an elliptigo machine across the country. I'd never heard of that before, but it was his latest challenge. And he did that. I think he was in his mid to late 60s when he did it. And so all different ways. And certainly it's very important to do it in an appropriate way for the stage that we're at and really the condition that we're in at that point in time, to stretch ourselves without injury or anything worse.
I want to go back to where we started, where we took a look at your website and how you've really integrated this passion that you have for the outdoors and adventure to the business. So some people would say, gosh, is that going to turn away potential clients because they're like, yeah, Josh is this adventure guy. That's not my thing. He's probably not my kind of advisor. What thoughts do you have as far as really going to the level that you have in turning your passion into your actual brand as a financial advisor? Do you have any sort of business advice in terms of what are the pros and cons of that? When might it make sense to do that? When might it not make sense to do that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I've certainly never been told, and I know there's some like self-selection in this comment, that I've never been told that the website was a turnoff. I've had people compliment it and say the pictures were cool or it had a really neat vibe to it. But I'm also at a point where I don't want to just mass market to and be a generalist to everyone. I do want our firm to grow, but I want to be very strategic about how we're doing that and who we bring in. And I want to enjoy working with the people that we bring in. And so part of this branding approach is hopefully the people that find us through that, or even use the website as a social verification that we're legit and who we say we are, that there's some commonality in the types of people. Yeah, and I hear this over and over in the podcast conversations, or I'll finish and go, man, if I lived closer to that guy, we'd be really good friends. There's just this element of, and I think especially true in the outdoor world, that it is a smaller group. It's not for everyone, but it's a group that all seems to be cut from a similar cloth. And if those are the kinds of people that find us through our website, that's a great start. And I hope that we can continue to build off of it.
Excellent. All right, Josh, anything else that you want to comment on or observations as we wrap up here?
I don't think so. I think it's been great fun to be intentional, to think through and communicate with you about where the podcast and the company and financial planning have overlapped, because this was not intentional out of the gate, but it just naturally has moved in that direction. And I think this is maybe the first time I've, over an hour period of time, verbalized where those connection pieces are. But I think one of the cool pieces that has been clear is that whether it's adventure or financial planning, that both of those are built on part courage and part caution, part planning and part perseverance. And I think that's maybe a good summary of what I've learned from doing both. And it's been a lot of fun. So I appreciate you having me on here.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to encapsulate the conversation. So I appreciate that, Josh, and encourage everyone to start listening to your podcast, subscribe to it, the On Adventure podcast with Josh Self. So again, Josh, thanks.
All right. Appreciate it.